There's a cycle in political history that always begins with hope and always ends in collapse. A cycle that has destroyed dozens of nations over the last century. A cycle that starts with the promise of equality and finishes with empty shelves, secret police, and people risking their lives to escape. It's the six-stage socialist implosion. And here's what should terrify you. The same cycle that wrecked Cuba and bankrupted Venezuela is emerging inside Western democracies, including the United States. Not because Americans suddenly love socialism, but because the conditions that make socialism possible are now everywhere: rising inequality, a distrusted elite class, a generation convinced the system is rigged, a public willing to trade freedom for fairness. This cycle does not start with communists waving red flags. It starts with citizens saying, "The system isn't working for us anymore." That is stage one. Discontent. Then comes stage two, populist promise. A movement saying, "Give us power and we'll fix everything." Stage three, power grab. The revolutionaries win through ballots or bullets. They take control not just of government, but of media, courts, and schools. Stage four, economic breakdown. The utopia promised evaporates. Shortages begin. Inflation rises. Blame shifts to enemies and saboteurs. Stage five, control through fear. If prosperity fails, obedience replaces it. Freedom becomes dangerous. Dissent becomes treason. Stage six, collapse. The system cannibalizes itself. Society becomes poorer, angrier, and desperate. This cycle destroyed Cuba's economy for generations. It turned Venezuela, the richest oil nation in Latin America, into a humanitarian disaster. And yet the call for state control, wealth redistribution, and ideological conformity is now growing louder in the very countries that once fought socialism. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, France. They think they're building justice. History says they're building collapse. The tragedy is that socialism never starts as tyranny. It starts as a righteous cause. People don't vote for dictatorship. They vote for fairness, and only realize what they lost when it's too late to get it back. Before we talk about America, we need to understand how two nations collapsed step by step, even when they believed they were building paradise. We begin with Cuba, the revolution that promised freedom, and ended in chains. Cuba did not choose tyranny. It chose justice. That's how the cycle always begins. In the 1,950 seconds, Cuba was deeply unequal. Wealth belonged to the elite landowners, casino bosses, foreign corporations. Most citizens lived poor, invisible lives. That was stage one, discontent, the soil of revolution. Then came the man who promised fairness, Fidel Castro. He didn't rise because people hated freedom. He rose because people hated corruption. Castro offered stage two, the populist promise: end poverty, give land to the peasants, take back Cuba from foreign influence, power to the people. Millions believed. The revolution succeeded. But the people's victory quickly became stage three, power grab. Private property seized. Political parties banned. Free press shut down. Schools and media turned into propaganda machines. The new regime said the sacrifices were temporary for the cause. But socialism always asks one more thing: trust us with all the power we know what's best. Then the economy collapsed. Under stage four, economic breakdown. Food rationing. Long lines for basic goods. Currency devaluation. Dependence on Soviet subsidies. Doctors and engineers paid like cafeteria workers. Equality was achieved because everyone was equally poor. When prosperity dies, fear takes its place. Stage five, control through fear. Secret police everywhere. Travel forbidden. Neighbors spying on neighbors. Jails filled with dissidents. Escape punished like treason. Cuba didn't build a workers' paradise. It built a prison island. And when the Soviet money stopped flowing in 1991, stage six collapse. Malnutrition became normal. Blackouts shut down the nation. Thousands fled on rafts, risking sharks to escape utopia. That is the socialist cycle. Hope, power shortage, fear, collapse. Cuba survived only by exporting doctors as cheap labor and relying on tourism from the capitalist world it still condemns. Yet politicians in the West praise Cuba's education and healthcare without mentioning the handcuffs attached to them. The lesson is brutal. When the state controls everything, everyone becomes property of the state. And the cycle didn't stop with Cuba. The same revolution, the same script, played out again in a country even richer, Venezuela, a nation with more oil than Saudi Arabia, a nation that socialist leaders turned into an economic graveyard. Venezuela should have been a miracle. It had everything. The largest proven oil reserves on Earth, a rising middle class, one of Latin America's richest economies. People believed the future would only get better. But prosperity can be a trap. When expectations rise faster than opportunity, resentment becomes political fuel. That was stage one discontent. Not from poverty, but from inequality. Then came the man of the people, Hugo Chavez, a soldier, a populist, a savior or so the crowds believed. He promised stage two, the populist promise: free health care, free education, cheap gasoline, food subsidies, power returned to the poor. Only one thing missing: how to pay for all of it. So Chavez nationalized the oil industry, giving it back to the people. This marked stage three power grab, media silenced, court packed, political opponents jailed or exiled, constitution rewritten, term limits abolished, all in the name of protecting the revolution. The warning signs were ignored because the money was still flowing, until the price of oil collapsed. Then came stage four economic breakdown. Hyperinflation over a hat, F's, currency, so worthless people used it as wallpaper. A single chicken cost a month's pay, food shortages, so severe children fainted in school, hospitals without medicine or electricity. Millions scavenged through garbage to survive. The government responded not with reform, but with stage five control through fear. Military guarding grocery stores. Secret police kidnapping dissidents. Citizens killed in the streets for protesting hunger. Opposition leaders disappeared. Elections manipulated or erased. The state didn't feed the people. It controlled the food, so it controlled the people. When humans must choose between obedience or starvation, they obey. Finally, stage six collapse. 7+ million Venezuelans fled the country. Women forced into prostitution across borders. Skilled workers now washing dishes abroad. A nation once envied, now pitied. All because leaders insisted they could defy economic reality with ideology and slogans. The socialist dream ended as it always does. Empty shelves, empty streets, empty promises. And this is the terrifying part. Venezuela didn't collapse because of bombs or invasion. It collapsed because its leaders believed, we will print prosperity. We will legislate abundance. We will make fairness mandatory. You cannot outlaw hunger. You only create more of it. And yet, the same policies, the same slogans, the same anger at the rich are now spreading rapidly through Western democracies. That is where the story goes next. Why socialism is returning in the United States, and why the cycle is already underway. Venezuela and Cuba didn't set out to destroy themselves. They set out to fix themselves. The tragedy is that the same emotional forces that opened the door to socialism there are now dominating politics in the West. People everywhere feel the same three things. Unease, the rich are getting richer. 2-1, the system is rigged. 3-4, someone needs to take control and make things fair. That is stage one discontent, taking root in modern democracies. And when discontent needs a hero, populists rise both left and right. Each side says the same thing in different words. Give us power, and we will punish the corrupt elites. That's stage two, the populist promise. The slogans sound familiar. Tax the rich, free college, cancel student debt, rent control, universal income. Healthcare is a right. No one should own more than they need. They sound compassionate. They feel righteous. They are politically unstoppable. But the critical question is always, who decides what is fair? History answers. Whoever takes power next. The ideological drift. Western politics no longer focuses on building growth, rewarding innovation, protecting private property. Instead, the narrative celebrates redistribution, state control, demonizing success, weaponizing envy. A generation now believes capitalism is the enemy, not because it failed, but because it succeeded unevenly. And politicians are exploiting that shift like a goldmine. Just vote for me, and I'll make the rich pay for everything. Exactly what Chavez said. Exactly what Castro said. Stage 3 is approaching fast. Democracies change quietly, until suddenly they're no longer democracies. Signs of power grab are emerging. Governments expanding executive authority, courts deciding elections instead of voters, censorship disguised as safety, corporations enforcing political ideology, intelligence agencies influencing public narratives. Power is centralizing, and centralization is the oxygen socialism breathes. The West is entering the part of the cycle where citizens still feel free, but only within limits drawn by forces they cannot see. The most dangerous lie. Socialism doesn't persuade people it will take away freedom. It persuades them freedom is unfair. When voters believe liberty creates injustice, they will demand the government take liberty away. And that demand is growing louder in the United States, Canada, and Europe. Where the cycle heads next depends on whether leaders restrain themselves from seizing total control, or whether they say the line that has destroyed every socialist nation in history. We're not like them, our revolution will work. Next, we dive deeper into the economics of collapse, why socialist promises always end with shortages, and why inflation becomes a weapon. Socialism doesn't fail because its goals are wrong. It fails because its math is wrong. The promises are always the same. Free healthcare, free housing, free education, guaranteed wages, cheap food and fuel, retirement security for all. But nothing is free. Someone pays. At first, the government taxes the rich. Then the rich leave or stop investing. So, the government taxes the middle class. Then the middle class collapses. Finally, the government prints money, and the printing press becomes the guillotine. That is when inflation becomes the real ruler. Why shortages always appear? When the state controls price, it also controls loss. If goods are too cheap to produce profitably, production stops, shelves empty, lines grow, citizens wait instead of work. Socialism always misunderstands incentives. If everyone is rewarded the same, no one works harder. Doctors become taxi drivers. Engineers become smugglers. Entrepreneurs become criminals because ambition becomes illegal. Equality is achieved by dragging everyone downward. The mirage of printing prosperity. When money runs out, leaders promise stimulus, relief, emergency spending. Every failing socialist regime declares, we can print what we cannot earn, but printed money doesn't create real goods. It only creates more money chasing fewer goods. Soon, grocery double every month. Savings evaporate. Retirement becomes impossible. Crime becomes a survival strategy. Inflation isn't just a number. It's a robbery performed in slow motion against every citizen in the country. The blame game. Stage 5 strategy. When the economy collapses, revolutionary leaders never admit fault. They find villains, greedy corporations, foreign sabotage, internal enemies undermining unity. End. This is how socialism shifts into control through fear. Price controls with armed enforcement. Ration cards. Police guarding food deliveries. Arrests for hoarding. Nationalization of any successful business. Punishing profit as exploitation. The result is predictable. A nation, once producing wealth, now fights over shrinking scraps. A system claiming to protect the poor creates more poverty than any free market policy ever could. The warning for the West. Look at the headlines today. Trillions printed in emergency spending. Inflation declared transitory, then unexpected. Governments attacking corporations for raising prices. Calls for rent freezes and price controls. Politicians promising endless free programs. Heavy debt with no plan to repay. These are not abstract theories. They are the exact same steps that destroyed every socialist economy in the 20th century. The only difference? This time, the collapse is approaching in countries that once led the free world. Next, we examine the psychological shift that marks stage 5, why people begin to accept control as a form of security and cheer while freedom is taken away. Every socialist collapse shares a chilling psychological turn. When prosperity fades, fear fills the vacuum. People who once demanded freedom begin demanding protection instead. Protection from greedy corporations, political extremists, misinformation, hoarders and speculators, anyone who questions the revolution, and as fear rises, freedom is redefined as danger. That's when Stage 5 control through fear locks in. The government becomes the only truth. Leaders declare, information can be harmful. We must protect you from lies. Censorship turns into safety. Propaganda turns into patriotism. Dissent turns into disloyalty. In Cuba, citizens were arrested for speaking. In Venezuela, citizens were jailed for tweeting. And today, in the West, ideas are banned as hate or disinformation. Algorithms silence the wrong opinions. Journalists protect power instead of exposing it. Freedom of speech dies quietly because people believe silence keeps them safe. The economy becomes a weapon. When shortages appear, leaders do not admit failure. They threaten those who notice it. You're hoarding, you're price gouging, you're exploiting the people. So, the state takes control of farms, factories, shipping, stores, fuel, wages, rents. And once the state controls what you own, it controls you. If your job, your food, and your apartment come from the government, opposition is no longer courageous. It's suicidal. The police become political. Every socialist implosion replaces laws with loyalty. Arrests without trial, surveillance of ordinary citizens, militarized police enforcing ideology, correct political opinions, mandatory for employment. The badge no longer protects rights. It enforces obedience. The culture turns on itself. Neighbors spy on neighbors. Coworkers report coworkers. Children report their own parents. Suspicion becomes a civic duty. A society, once united by hope, becomes united by fear. The new reality, at this stage, socialist governments always insist your sacrifices are necessary until we achieve equality. But equality never arrives, because fear doesn't build paradise. It builds prisons. And by the time citizens realize they are trapped, the only way out is escape or revolt. Cuba learned this. Venezuela learned this. Every socialist nation learns this eventually. The West believes it is different. Exceptional, immune to collapse. So did every nation before collapse arrived. Next, we examine how Stage 6 strikes, not gradually, but all at once, turning once wealthy societies into the sparity ones overnight. Collapse doesn't ask permission. It doesn't schedule a warning. It arrives suddenly, after years of being ignored. Stage 6 is not when a nation starts failing. It's when the nation admits it already failed. This is the moment when the promises run out and the consequences arrive. What Stage 6 looks like in real life? In every socialist implosion, the signs are identical. Cash becomes worthless. Savings are wiped out overnight. Supermarkets turn into empty rooms. Hospitals run out of medicine. Electricity becomes unreliable. Crime becomes survival. The middle class disappears. People flee the country in massive waves. It's not theoretical. It's not academic. It's real, and millions of people alive today have lived through it. In Cuba, parents told children they were lucky to eat 2 small meals a day. In Venezuela, families baked bread made from pet food. When the government controls the economy, and the economy collapses, the government controls who lives and who starves. Collapse is fast, rebuilding is slow. A system that took decades to build can crumble in months. But rebuilding trust, that can take generations. In socialism, Stage 6, skilled workers migrate. Businesses shut down permanently. Investment disappear. Corruption becomes the only functioning system. The future becomes a threat, not a dream. The tragedy is that collapse doesn't punish elites. They keep wealth and power. Collapse punishes children, workers, ordinary families, people who believed the promises, the ones who cheered the loudest, suffer the quietest. How it ends. Every socialist collapse resolves in one of 2 ways. One-eyed reform from within. Leaders admit failure and reverse course. Rare, resisted, and often too late, argibe, regime change. The state is overthrown. Chaos, violence, or foreign intervention often follow. History shows no collapsed socialist system has ever returned to prosperity unchanged. Once freedom is traded away, earning it back demands a terrible cost. Why this matters now. For the first time in modern history, Western economies are printing money at historic levels. Governments are expanding control over speech, markets, and energy. Young populations believe the state must guarantee equality. Politicians gain power by promising fairness without cost. Inflation is rising while productivity falls. Blame is shifting onto enemies, not policies. The socialist cycle has already begun in the West. Stage 6 is not here yet, but the path is visible, and the next choices determine the ending. Next, we reveal who benefits when Western democracies weaken, because some nations have been studying this collapse for decades and are preparing to take advantage the moment it arrives. Collapse never happens in silence. When one power falls, another rises to replace it. And right now, the world is full of rivals, waiting for the West to weaken just enough so they can step into the vacuum. Because the truth is, socialist collapse doesn't just hurt the nation that falls. It reshapes the entire world around it. Let's look at the 3 biggest benefactors. 1E2, China, the model of efficient authoritarianism. Beijing is selling a simple message to the world. Democracy is chaos. State control is stability. As Western nations struggle with debt, inflation, riots, and division, China showcases booming infrastructure, global manufacturing dominance, rising military power, centralized decision-making, and many developing nations are listening. If Western societies tear themselves apart through populism and socialist policy, China wins without firing a shot. RDIBS. Russia, master of vacuum politics. Every time the West weakens, Russia expands. Georgia, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, Syria. Moscow's strategy is ancient. Watch empires overextend, then take what they can no longer defend. If America loses economic and political strength, NATO fractures. Europe splinters under energy dependency. Russian influence surges across the continent. Putin doesn't need socialism to win. He only needs the West to believe lies about the cost of freedom. Sandiu, ideological movements worldwide. When the West loses confidence, radical ideologies fill the void. Extremist nationalism, religious authoritarianism, communist revival, theocratic revolutions. They tell the suffering masses, you're poor because the elites stole your future. And history proves, the poorer a nation becomes, the easier it is to radicalize. Collapse créate disciples, hungry for someone to blame and someone to follow. What about Western citizens? They become spectators in their own decline. Wealth collapses. Rights become conditional. Borders lose meaning. Identity becomes tribal. And the next generation grows up believing freedom failed. Control is the answer. That is how socialism doesn't just destroy economies, it destroys nations' confidence in liberty itself. The global power shift, if Western democracies fall into stage 6, the free world loses its leader. The global economy rewrites itself. Authoritarian powers set the rules. The 21st century becomes their century. The socialist implosion doesn't just break one country, it breaks the idea of the West. And that's the moment foreign rivals have been preparing for patiently. Now, the final question, is collapse inevitable? Or can Western nations stop the cycle before it hits stage 6? The answer defines whether the world enters a dark age or a rebirth. Every socialist collapse has one final moment. The moment when a nation must decide, admit the system is failing, or double down on the system that caused the failure. Most countries choose denial. That's why socialism doesn't fade quietly. It implodes. Because no leader ever says, we promised too much. We spent too much. We controlled too much. Instead, they blame hoarders, greedy corporations, the rich, foreign sabotage, domestic enemies. The policies remain. The pressure increases. Freedom shrinks. The cycle accelerates. The only escape route. There is a way out, but it is rare and painful. Unuhaj. Admit economic reality. Doi. Restore private enterprise. Trido. Encourage innovation over dependency. Forride. Depoliticize courts, media, and education. 5-3. Shrink government power drastically. 6%. Rebuild trust through transparency. But here's the problem. Those reforms threaten the very politicians who caused the crisis. So they choose loyalty to power over responsibility to the people. Reform requires humility. Governments flooded with arrogance cannot reform. The fear of freedom. This is the most disturbing truth. When socialism erodes prosperity long enough, people forget freedom and become afraid of it. Freedom means risk, responsibility, effort, opportunity, but no guarantees. After years of dependency, citizens say, "Please take care of me," instead of, "Let me take care of myself." People don't fight to regain liberty when they've learned to survive without it. Time is the real enemy. Once the cycle reaches stage 4 or 5, there is only a small window to reverse course. If leaders ignore the warning signs, stage 6 doesn't arrive gradually, it arrives violently. In Venezuela, the turnaround chance existed in 2007. By 2014, too late. Cuba had its window in the 1,980 seconds. It slammed shut. Western democracies, including the United States, are staring at their window right now. If they wait for the breaking point becomes permanent. The hardest truth of all. Socialism never collapses because it's unpopular. It collapses because it becomes impossible. A nation can ignore math longer than it can ignore hunger. When the shelves empty, ideology dies, and the future arrives. Next, what the world looks like after socialist collapse hits the West, and whether freedom survives or becomes a museum exhibit of a lost era. When stage 6 hits a socialist economy, the collapse is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the next one. A nation that once led the world now stands in line for food. A population that once traveled freely now begs for visas. A system that once inspired others now becomes a cautionary tale. What replaces the Western order will determine the next century of human history. Scenario A, the renewal of freedom. In a best-case ending, people rise up. The socialist experiment is rejected. A new constitution or major reform restores liberty. Power returns to local communities. Markets reopen. Innovation reignites prosperity. This is what happened to nations like Estonia, Poland, Czech Republic, South Korea. They escaped disaster because the people refused to surrender their future. The United States could follow this path, but only if citizens choose responsibility over resentment. Scenario B, managed tyranny. The most common ending, government keeps total control. Elections become a show. Food, housing, careers depend on loyalty. Culture becomes propaganda. The economy never recovers. A new ruling class becomes permanent. This is Cuba. This is North Korea. This is every socialist paradise that still exists. Freedom becomes a memory, spoken quietly, like a crime. Scenario C, fragmentation and chaos. The worst ending, states or regions break away. Militias control territory. Black markets replace stores. Armed factions decide the law. Foreign powers seize influence. This is Venezuela's future, if nothing changes. It could be America's future, if collapse hits a nation of 330 million armed citizens. Socialism promises unity, but delivers a nation that can no longer stay together. What decides the ending? Not the politicians, not the elites, not the wealthy. It's the moment ordinary people decide, I will no longer wait for the government to save me. Revolution destroy excuses. Collapses expose character. When the state fails, people must rise. The cycle either becomes a rebirth or a grave. Liberty either returns stronger or disappears forever. The final question. The West once believed it would lead humanity forever. Now it must answer, do we still believe freedom is worth the price? Or is safety under control easier than responsibility under liberty? The socialist cycle doesn't care what you believe. It only cares what you do. And right now, the West must act or accept collapse, because history will not save any nation that refuses to save itself.